Hello, fellow travelers of history and seekers of compelling tales. Before we delve into the heart of this extraordinary narrative, I invite you to join our growing community. If this journey through the past captivates your imagination, remember to like this story, share it with those who appreciate the echoes of bygone eras, and subscribe to our channel for more immersive experiences. Your support helps us bring these forgotten voices to life. Now lean in close and let the winds of memory carry you back to a time when the very earth rebelled and the spirit of a nation was tested under a sky of relentless dust. The sky above Silas Miller's farm in Black Mesa, Oklahoma, was not merely gray. It was a bruise, a festering wound, bleeding ochre and umber across the western horizon. It was April 1935, and the air, thick and metallic, tasted of pulverized topsoil and the desperate prayers of men who had seen their world wither to dust. Silas, his 32 years etched with the premature lines of relentless sun and unyielding worry, stood on his porch, a sentinel against an invisible enemy. His lungs, already a rasping bellows from years of breathing the omnipresent grit, burned with each shallow intake. He hid the coughs, burying them deep, just as he buried the fear that clawed at him, lest it take root in Martha, his wife, or worse, in their children, 9-year-old Ellie and little 5-year-old Billy. Inside the small clapboard house, Martha was battling her own war, sealing the cracks around the windows with damp rags, a futile ritual against the insidious invasion. Ellie, her usually bright eyes shadowed with a wisdom far beyond her years, helped her mother, while Billy, oblivious, sat on the floor, pushing a worn wooden truck through imaginary fields, humming a tuneless melody that offered a fragile counterpoint to the howling wind outside. A sudden, distant rumble vibrated through the earth, a sound Silas knew too well. It wasn't thunder. It was the advance of a black roller, a monstrous wall of dust that devoured horizons and swallowed hope whole. This one felt different, heavier, charged with an almost malevolent energy. Silas felt a cold dread seep into his bones, a premonition that this particular storm would mark an undeniable end. "Martha!" he yelled, his voice rough against the rising shriek of the wind. "Get the children into the cellar, now!" His urgency sliced through the air like a knife. Martha's eyes met his, wide with unspoken terror, but she didn't question. She scooped up Billy, her hand grabbing Ellie's, and urged them towards the small earthen cellar entrance just outside the kitchen door. The wind was a physical force now, tearing at Silas's clothes, whipping dust into his eyes until they streamed. He stumbled back inside, grabbing the emergency lantern and a jug of water. Just as he reached the cellar steps, a roar engulfed the house. It was not merely wind, it was the sound of the world tearing itself apart. The black roller hit. The house groaned, timbers creaking like the bones of an old man under immense strain. Darkness descended with a terrifying swiftness, not the gentle twilight of evening, but an absolute suffocating void, as if the very sun had been blotted out of existence. The air grew instantly heavy, a thick, gritty blanket pressing down. Down in the damp, cool sanctuary of the cellar, the small family huddled together. The earthen walls offered a momentary reprieve from the howling chaos, but the fine dust still seeped through every crevice, creating a ghostly haze in the flickering lantern light. Ellie, no longer humming, whimpered softly, clutching Martha's dress. Ellie, ever the stoic, buried her face in her father's side, her small body trembling. Silas held them tight, his calloused hands a fortress, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. He knew this storm was worse. He could feel it in the way the earth vibrated, in the distant but distinct thud as something heavy, perhaps a shed, perhaps a neighbor's barn, collapsed under the sheer force of the elements. He thought of his wheat fields, the desiccated stalks already long gone, but now even the barren soil itself was being ripped away, piece by agonizing piece, leaving behind only bedrock and the ghosts of prosperity. Hours passed in the suffocating darkness, marked only by the dwindling oil in the lantern and the relentless grinding sound of the dust storm outside.
When at last the roar began to subside, giving way to a mournful moan, Silas knew it was time. He pushed open the heavy wooden door, Martha and the children blinking behind him, their faces masked with dust. What greeted them was not the familiar, if barren, landscape, but an alien world. The sky, though no longer black, was a perpetual twilight, a sickly orange-brown. Everything was covered in a thick, choking layer of fine red dust, drifts that piled against the house, burying fences, transforming the familiar into something unrecognizable. The once proud windmill was bent at an impossible angle, its blades mangled. The small chicken coop was gone, vanished without a trace. Their truck, the rusted Model T, was half buried, a skeletal silhouette against the bruised horizon. This was no longer their farm. It was a tomb. Silas looked at Martha, her eyes mirroring his own despair. They had fought for so long, clung to every shred of hope, prayed for rain that never came, then for an end to the dust that always did. But this was the final straw. His mind went to the tethered yellow flyer he kept tucked in his Bible, a promise of orange groves and work aplenty in the distant mythical land of California. He had dismissed it as a fool's dream for so long, but now, with his world literally blowing away, it was the only dream left. "We can't stay here, Martha," he said, his voice raw, his throat burning. "There's nothing left, not for us, not for the children." Martha nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line of grim determination. She looked at Ellie, then at Billy, who was trying to dig his small truck out of a dust drift, a futile endeavor. "Where will we go, Silas?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "California," he replied, the word a prayer, a desperate gamble, a whisper of hope against the overwhelming silence of their ruined home. "To the orange groves." The decision was made, heavy and final. The next few days were a blur of frantic activity, of sifting through the dust-choked remains of their lives. They packed only what was essential, what could fit into the battered Model T. A few changes of clothes, a skillet, a worn quilt, their meager savings, and the precious flyer, now Silas's compass. Leaving was like tearing a part of their own flesh. They walked past the small, unadorned graves of Silas's parents and grandparents, simple wooden crosses half buried in the encroaching dust. It was the hardest farewell, a severing of generations, a betrayal of the land that had sustained them until it could no longer do so. As the Model T, coughing and sputtering, finally pulled away from the desiccated shell of their home, Silas cast one last look back. The wind, though calmer, still carried the dust, blurring the edges of memory, slowly erasing their existence from the landscape. It was a stark reminder that they were not just leaving a farm, they were leaving an entire way of life, stepping into the terrifying unknown, chasing a dream across a map drawn in desperation and faint promises. The dust between them and the life they knew was a gulf wider than any ocean. The engine of the Model T coughed, sputtered, and then, with a groan, settled into a rhythmic thrum, a small, defiant heartbeat against the vast silence of the ruined plains. Mile after mile, the landscape remained the same. Endless stretches of cracked earth, skeletal trees stripped bare, and the ubiquitous dust hanging in the air like a perpetual shroud. Their faces, once etched with the quiet dignity of farmers, now bore the haggard mask of migrants, Okies, as the newspapers contemptuously called them.
Ellie, usually so resilient, grew quieter with each passing day. She would stare out the window, her small hand tracing patterns in the dust on the glass, her thoughts far away. Billy, restless in the confined space, often asked, "Are we there yet, Papa? Is California shiny?" Silas would offer a weary smile, a gentle pat on the head, and a promise he wasn't sure he could keep. Martha, ever practical, rationed their meager food and water, her eyes constantly scanning the roadside for signs of life, for salvation, for anything that promised a break from the monotony of their desperate flight. The highway, Route 66, was a ribbon of broken dreams, stretching endlessly westward. They were not alone.
Other vehicles, similarly laden with mattresses, pots, and the last vestiges of shattered lives, crawled alongside them. Jalopies, trucks, and even horse-drawn wagons. They were a silent procession, bound by a shared desperation, a common hope for a greener land. At night, they would pull over, finding small clearings beside the road, or joining larger makeshift camps, Hoovervilles, as they were cynically named after the president. Here, among strangers, a fragile sense of community would bloom under the vast star-pricked sky. Campfires flickered like defiant embers in the darkness, and the scent of thin stew mingled with the ever-present dust. Stories were shared, hushed and weary, of farms lost, of impossible deaths, of children growing frail. Silas, ever watchful, would trade sparse news with other men, gleaning rumors of work, of routes to avoid, of towns that welcomed migrants and those that chased them away with shotguns. One evening, by a particularly large campfire in eastern New Mexico, a wizened old man with a face like dried leather sat strumming a battered banjo. His fingers, gnarled with age and labor, coaxed a haunting melody from the strings, a bluesy tune that spoke of hardship and resilience. Silas, tired beyond words, found himself drawn to the music. He sat on the dusty ground, Billy asleep on his lap, Ellie resting her head against Martha's shoulder. The old man's voice was a gravelly whisper, telling a story of rivers running dry and crops turning to dust. It was their story, played out in melody. When the song ended, the old man looked at Silas, his eyes, ancient and knowing, twinkling in the firelight. "Rough road, ain't it, son?" he croaked. Silas nodded. "Rough enough to break a man." The old man smiled, a slow, sad smile. "Break some, forges others. What you got left to give, that's what matters now." He picked up his banjo again, playing a lighter, more hopeful tune this time, a melody that spoke of distant hills and rivers flowing free. For a moment, amidst the desolation, the music became a fragile bridge, connecting their shared humanity, reminding Silas that even in the deepest despair, the human spirit, like a stubborn weed, found a way to push through the cracked earth. Days bled into weeks. The Model T, a testament to enduring American engineering, developed its own ailments, a persistent grinding in the engine, a slow leak in the radiator, and then the inevitable, a flat tire in the middle of nowhere under the blistering Arizona sun. Silas cursed under his breath, the words tasting like ash. He had no spare, and the nearest town was miles away. Desperation clawed at him. Martha, seeing his despair, quietly reached into her pocket. "Here, Silas," she said, her voice steady. "Take this." In her palm lay his wedding ring, a simple gold band, his only possession of true value. His heart sank. He had promised her so much, and now he couldn't even keep this. He shook his head. "No, Martha, I can't," but she insisted. "It's just metal, Silas. We need to get to California. For them." Her gaze shifted to their children, huddled in the shade of the truck, their faces pale with thirst and weariness. The unspoken plea in her eyes was a hammer blow. With a heavy heart, Silas took the ring. He walked for hours under the merciless sun, the ring clutched tight in his hand, a symbol of everything he was sacrificing, of everything he hoped to regain. He found a small gas station, barely more than a shack, run by a gaunt, suspicious man.
The tire cost him not only the ring, but also the last few dollars they possessed. As he walked back, empty-handed but with a patched tire, he felt a strange sense of lightness, as if shedding the last vestiges of his old life had prepared him for whatever lay ahead. They were truly rootless now, stripped bare, relying solely on the hope of the promised land. The landscape slowly began to change. The endless brown began to give way to faint hints of green, a deceptive promise in the distance. They crossed the border into California, the land that haunted their dreams, only to find it was not the welcoming embrace they had envisioned. Instead, state lines were guarded, signs warning Okies go home were plastered on every post, and the locals regarded them with suspicion and disdain. The roads were still choked with migrants, but the hopeful buzz had been replaced by a grim determination.
The orange groves Silas had dreamed of were not idyllic paradises, but vast, regimented fields, and the work aplenty came with conditions, back-breaking labor for starvation wages under the watchful eyes of armed guards. They settled in a sprawling, ramshackle labor camp on the outskirts of Bakersfield, a makeshift collection of tents and shacks in a dusty field. The air here, though free of the dust storms, still hung heavy with the smell of unwashed bodies, despair, and the faint, sweet scent of citrus that mocked their poverty. Silas quickly found work in the orange groves. His hands, once accustomed to the broad sweep of wheat, now learned the delicate art of picking fruit without bruising it. The sun beat down relentlessly, the work was endless, and the pay barely enough to buy a single meal for his family. His cough worsened, a persistent rattling sound that Martha worried over constantly. He saw the looks the other workers gave him, the knowing glances, the whispers of dust lung. But he pushed on, driven by the image of Ellie and Billy, their faces thinner, but now, finally, free from the choking dust. One sweltering afternoon, a dispute erupted in the groves. The foreman, a hulking man with a sneer perpetually plastered on his face, accused a young worker of stealing an orange and threatened to have him thrown out without pay. The injustice of it, coupled with the relentless heat and his own failing strength, snapped something inside Silas. He stepped forward, his voice raspy but firm. "He didn't steal it. We're paid so little a man gets hungry." The foreman turned on him, his eyes blazing. "You got something to say, Okie? Maybe you want to join him outside the fence?" A tense silence fell over the grove. The other workers held their breath, fearing the inevitable violence. Silas stood his ground, his gaze unwavering. He thought of his family, of the long journey, of all they had endured. He wouldn't back down. Not now. Not when he had brought them this far. "I just want fair pay like you promised," Silas said, his voice stronger than he felt, "so my children can eat." The confrontation ended not with blows, but with a surprising retreat from the foreman, shamed by the collective, silent support of the other workers and the simple, undeniable truth of Silas's plea. They didn't get better wages that day, but Silas had earned the respect of his fellow migrants, and more importantly, he had rediscovered a strength within himself he hadn't known he possessed. That evening, as the sun dipped below the distant hills, painting the sky in fiery hues of orange and purple, Silas watched Ellie and Billy sit on an upturned crate, each holding a freshly picked orange. The fruit was vibrant, plump, and perfect, a stark contrast to the dust-choked plains they had left behind. They peeled them slowly, their small fingers fumbling, and then bit into the juicy flesh, their faces lighting up with pure, unadulterated joy. It was the first time Silas had seen such unburdened happiness in their eyes. He sat beside Martha, her hand finding his, her touch a silent comfort. His lungs still burned, his body ached, and their future was still uncertain. They hadn't found riches or the shining city of gold they might have once imagined. California was not a literal paradise. It was a place of hardship and struggle, just like Oklahoma. But here, there was hope. Here, the earth was alive, and the dust did not consume everything. The American dream, he realized, wasn't about possessing land or wealth, but about the resilience of the human spirit, the enduring strength of family, and the ability to find beauty and joy in the smallest of moments, even after losing everything. As the last rays of sunlight faded, casting long, peaceful shadows over the makeshift camp, Silas watched his children, their faces sticky with orange juice, their laughter a sweet melody on the evening air. The dust between them and their past was now a vast and uncrossable chasm, but ahead, though shrouded in the lingering uncertainties of life, lay the promise of a new dawn, bathed in the soft glow of a California sunset. They had survived, and that in itself was a victory.